So it's week 2 of Call of the Mountain, so I figure it's about time I return to my matchup breakdowns. The problems that I've been running into is that, one, I can't do exactly what I want to do, which is show you both sides of the matchup and how both decks can actually win at the favored deck and the unfavored deck, and I'm also not even really finding enough footage for me to show you the same deck twice. So instead what we're going to be doing this time around is we're going to take a look at Type V versus Zero from round 4 of Rune Cup Brazil. Type V pilots Twisted Fate Swain in both of these games, and Zero plays 2 different aggro decks, Scouts first and then Discard Aggro. And I want to show you how Twisted Fate Swain, which is praised for its widespread of matchups, actually handles these aggro decks. First we're going to see the Scout deck, then we're going to see the Discard Aggro deck, and try and go through what it takes for each deck to win that matchup while the games play out on screen. And yeah, I hope you guys find it a little bit entertaining, a little bit insightful, and you get to hear me rant for about 10 minutes apiece on aggro versus Twisted Fate Swain. So if that is a matchup that you've been struggling with, maybe you're looking for a little bit of insight into, I'm sure I've got 1 or 2 nuggets of information that you're going to find in those rants that is useful to you. So as I had mentioned, first matchup breakdown of the new set, Twisted Fate Swain versus Scouts, and then Twisted Fate Swain versus Discard Aggro. One of the reasons that I want to do this is because, one, it's very difficult, nearly impossible to find sort of the normal criteria that I want for a matchup breakdown of one deck winning and one deck losing, because there hasn't been a lot of tournament footage, there's still so many new decks, people are still figuring out the meta, but 2 things that we are consistently seeing: Twisted Fate Swain and these aggro decks. There was just the same number of representation of Discard Aggro as Aurelian Soul decks in the top cut of this Rune Cup Brazil tournament. So I do want to get these aggro decks versus Twisted Fate Swain, because Twisted Fate Swain is so often regarded for its great widespread of matchups, and I want to show you how it actually fares against the aggro decks of the format, because those are kind of the wild card decks. So we're going to start off with Scouts, then we'll get into Discard Aggro after this, and we'll just kind of see how these play out. So the board-centric Scout deck is actually a little bit difficult for TF Swain to deal with. Your removal doesn't pair up super well onto them, and by that I mean Death's Hand. Ravenous Flock is cool, but it can be difficult to sort of line up the damage onto the units first. House Spider goes great in that regard. Make It Rain, really not going to kill a whole lot, and does get pretty much completely negated by Ranger's Resolve unless you have a barrel, and, you know, kind of stuff like that. And then Noxian Fervor, of course, is just an expensive spell in of itself, and the fact that you have to sacrifice a unit, it can get negated by something like single combat. It's a bit of a risk into a matchup like this, and pretty early on you actually run out of things to kill it with. So, taking a look at how things play out here, House Spider is actually a phenomenal opener for Type V and the Twisted Fate Swain deck in general, because you get to do things like Noxian Fervor with it. And here we see the Ranger's Resolve. This is what I was talking about. This is a card that absolutely blows out decks like this. Zero gets to keep the entire board. And then on this next turn, we could see the Twisted Fate Swain swing it back into their favor if Type V were to open up the turn with a Twisted Fate's red card or a Make It Rain. Then, you know, he'd actually have a really good shot at keeping this board under control, you know, not letting the Bannerman get down. And that'd be really good. Turn 4, if you can keep your opponent's board clear by turn 4 as the Twisted Fate Swain deck, they have really weak turns. It's really just Grizzled Ranger and Bannerman that you see in the 4-drop slot of these decks. And a Bannerman coming down, or a Grizzled Ranger rather coming down here, wouldn't be super threatening into that Spiderling that you do have. You would sort of get the free block onto it next turn. And if your opponent doesn't go for an open attack, then you have the access to things like Arachnoid Sentry, stun them out. It's once you get into turn 5 and 6 that things get a little bit more awkward, because things like Quinn and Genevieve Elmhart are such good units into an open board. Here we see the Twisted Fate come out, and yeah, this is where things get really awkward. This could have been a bit of a throw on the side of Type V, and this is just something that I want to highlight. Respect the Bannerman. If you're going into turn 4 and your opponent has units that line up perfectly under your removal, make the first thing you do that turn play your removal. If we had seen a red card out of Type V there, Zero's turn probably would have just been Laurent Protege because he didn't have the Ranger. You're not going to play Bannerman onto no board, and then the Quinn would come out this turn. Things still not looking phenomenal. Would still have a great turn here, but not as great of a turn. You know what I mean? And that's kind of what you're looking for, is there's narrow spaces where you do get to find advantages. So for this particular game at hand, Zero is going to easily pick off the Twisted Fate, get through some damage with the Quinn. Maybe we see a block from the Spiderling into a Ravenous Flock. The no block coming out from the Spiderling does sort of imply that we don't have a flock, which is very unfortunate. That is one of the cards that you want to mulligan for in a matchup like this, being able to take out the Quinn or the Misfortune in combination with our Arachnoid Sentry. Very, very good. Now we see Zep Sprayfin come down. It's okay in this matchup. It's a little bit slow for what you want to be doing. This is not the kind of matchup where you want to see all your draw power. In aggro matchups in general, you kind of want to mulligan away the draw power because it can be difficult to find time to play them. You're busy playing mana efficiently on removal, and here we're going to see, this is Zap Sprayfin get taken out. 4 mana to draw a 3 damage spell, or a 3 mana spell rather. Really not feeling too great for you here. And then we see Zap line up onto this Bannerman. This kind of implies that another Make It Rain or Twisted Fate will be coming down. Not really anything that Zero's going to be able to do about that. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, whatever. I'm an idiot. And Zero probably just going to run out his Cytheria here. And Cytheria is something that's like okay on its own. It's not quite Genevieve good, and here we do see the respect for the Bannerman / Genevieve played out this time around. Just going to open up with that red card, and look at how clean and small that board is. Absolutely beautiful. But Type V is not out of the woods yet. You really haven't developed anything. Your board is still extremely weak, and there's really not a lot of great mid-rangey units in Twisted Fate Swain, and that is why it does struggle with these high health and sticky units coming out of the Scout deck. Laurent Protege having 4 HP, pretty difficult to deal with, is going to kill most of your units. House Spider, Twisted Fate, Petty Officer, Dreadway Deckhand, all that kind of stuff. Doesn't really die to a whole lot. I think you have to proactively play your removal with the barrels in a matchup like this, and it can be very scary. There's a lot of space for you to get punished by single combat, and here we even see Zero not block with anything on that Twisted Fate 1, because 2 damage really isn't that much to take at this point. It's not like Type V is going to be able to burn him out anytime soon. And 2, you want to be respectful of Death's Hand. You don't want your opponent to be able to sort of get your units off for free, and once again, this salvage is pretty much a nothing turn. Type V's board is so weak compared to his opponents, and this is what the Scout deck is looking to do. Overwhelm your opponent on board. Other than Swain, your proteges kill just about every unit in this deck that comes down for less than 8 mana. 2 damage is not a hard threshold to hit in a Scout deck. Fleet Feather Tracker hits that, Protege hits that, literally anything in your deck that you single combat is going to hit that, and it's not like the Twisted Fate is ever going to be a realistic win condition for the Twisted Fate Swain player, like it is in some other matchups like Aurelion Soul. Aurelion Soul decks and Targon decks in general don't handle units very well, and so the Twisted Fate level up win condition is very apparent in those, not so much in the aggro matchups. Sure, if you get it off, it's, the absolute dream. Yeah, you'll win the game, but it's really unrealistic to happen, as we do see represented by these proteges coming down. And even if Zero could just find a way to level the Quinn, then the constant Valor spam, easy to pick off these 2 health units. Turn 7, once again, very awkward. Like, it's so... Yeah, we just see 2 removal spells come out to try and, play around either the Bannerman or the Genevieve coming out here. And this sucks because you don't get full value off the Fervor. Generally, you want to declare your unit as a blocker and then Fervor it onto something else to get sort of maximum value. And that just doesn't work out for Type V here. The Twisted Fate Swain deck has no real impactful units from about turn 1 to turn 7. Everything is going to have 2 HP except for the Swain itself, and I think that as a Twisted Fate Swain player, you have to not be afraid to trade with your Swain and sort of use its health pool as a resource to try and 2-for-1 some of your opponent's units. So the Scout deck being more on the aggressive to mid-range side is what makes it a little bit difficult for the Twisted Fate Swain deck. Just the removal of the TF Swain doesn't line up as cleanly into Scouts as it does into a lot of other decks, and that's always been the strength of Bannerman decks, is how tough the butts on your units are. So now we're going to move on to Twisted Fate Swain versus Discard Aggro. This is a matchup that's a little bit weird and hard to call because luck does play into it a lot on the side of the Discard Aggro deck. Typically, what you're going to be doing as the Twisted Fate Swain player is trying to fight for board while maintaining your life total, and it gets really awkward because you probably have to use your removal a little bit inefficiently. Things like Draven are high priority targets, but they're hard to kill. Noxian Fervor onto your early units isn't the safest play in the world because it does get negated by something like a Mystic Shot, and if you lose advantage while losing the board, there's no way that you're going to come back into this one. Or you are susceptible to the burn package that your opponent has available to them. And Zero actually plays more of a burn-heavy style of the deck with things like Boom Kuroki and Legion Saboteur. We see him start off here, already deals 3 damage on turn 1, and you feel like you have to string together multiple removal spells to actually get anything accomplished. Luckily, this Saboteur will die to a Make It Rain, and then you can clean up the Boom Crew with something like a Death's Hand. But if you do that, and then Draven comes down, what are you realistically doing to prevent that on the next turn? All of a sudden, you're going to fall down to 14 life, and you're not going to be in a situation where you can get Leviathan locks out on turn 8. You're going to be too low by then. A Jinx off the top into a Super Mega Death Rocket could just spell Doom for you at that point. It feels like the Twisted Fate Swain deck does have to play more aggressively in this matchup than it usually does, which is really hard to balance with the fact that you are constantly trying to remove every single unit that your opponent plays in order to get that done. I think that Swain actually comes up really big in a matchup like this, whereas Twisted Fate really only does if it's paired with a barrel. There are situations where a naked Twisted Fate will get it done. For example, I had mentioned that Zero is playing a more burn-focused version of this deck, and the other version that we typically see is a little more go wide with crowd favorite, and if your opponent opens with something like a Zonite into a Jury Rig and then goes for a Poro Cannon play next turn, sure, Make It Rain and Twisted Fate's red card can get a lot of value, but Zero goes a little bit more for the pillar strategy, says I'd actually like some stickier units, and that's going to be a little bit harder for Type V to deal with in general, because while you're constantly trying to use one card to trade for one card, you're eventually going to have to trade 2 cards for your opponent's Jinx, unless you can get down a barreled up Noxian Fervor, but that's really scary to try and do because the Mystic Shot can come out to negate that. Now, if your opponent is emptying their hand in order to level the Jinx, sure, that is a window where you can get it done, but it's not like the barrel gets to sit on board forever because it can just be dragged to your opponent's attacker by the vulnerable. Here we're going to see Petty Officer, that's actually going to summon a 1-drop. We're not going for anything super spooky like that, and Zero here does find the Jinx, can go ahead and pillar up on that one. As I had mentioned, it's probably going to take 2 cards for Zero to actually kill that one, and at that point, it kind of matters how the discard aggro player went about emptying their hand. Zero kind of has the dream opportunity here of, oh, I get to do it with a Rummage, so I'll still have 2 cards after the fact. Even if you do end up killing my Jinx, then I don't have to worry about that because I will still have a little bit of a hand after the fact, and I'm going to level her. You're going to have to use 2 spells. All things are kind of hunky-dory. The problem that both players are going to run into is Type V is now suddenly, because he has to use 2 spells on the Jinx, isn't very confident in his ability to remove a second copy of Jinx. And Zero is worried that he's never going to find a second copy of Jinx. And maybe this is where things take a turning point. There's a decision that Zero has to make here. Because you're already on turn 5, next turn is Augmented Experimenter turn. So maybe you go for Mystic Shot here and then Rummage and you still have 2 cards. You go into your next turn, you get 4 cards. Or maybe it's better to just use the Experimenter to level the Jinx here, or on the next turn rather. Zero is going to go for the Mystic Shot Rummage play. I do think that is a little bit correct just because the 2 draws that you're going to get out of the Jinx is fine, and when your opponent is only on 2 mana, they're not going to actually be able to kill your Jinx this turn. Ravenous Flock is a necessary part of killing the Jinx, and with 1 mana, your opponent doesn't have an activator to actually push damage onto her. The awkward part is that you do lose your Augmented Experimenter, and I do like going for the quicker strategy against Type V's deck, and this is what I was talking about earlier, getting aggressive. You know that your opponent doesn't want to block with this Jinx because any damage pushed onto her opens her up to Ravenous Flock, and that's true of pretty much any unit. Even if your opponent is playing the crowd favorite version, they still don't really want to block with that crowd favorite unless it's that full 7/6 and you're attacking with a 1-attack unit, of which you play no copies. It'd have to be something summoned off a Petty Officer or something summoned off of a House Spider. And now if we did see a Swain out of Type V to go ahead and try and block out the Jinx, that's another really sketchy situation for the Twisted Fate Swain player. Because Jinx has quick attack, anything from a Vision, Get Excited, Mystic Shot, an extra copy of Jinx that is also a Get Excited, an Axe from a Draven, suddenly makes it so that your Swain just dies for nothing. And here Zero does find a little bit more draw power, is going to be able to get out a Rocket, but with Type V getting that Hapless Aristocrat, he's actually got a better field of blockers than you would typically expect. The Rocket being able to clear out things like the House Spider 1/1, as well as most things that come off the Petty Officer, usually serves very well for the discard aggro player in terms of actually pushing damage. So Type V did a kind of high roll that one in terms of just walling up, and so far on turn 6, 12 health is really not where you want to be looking at your opponent, and Zap Sprayfin going to come out, that's going to get him another spell, and that's absolutely crucial in this matchup. As I said, you're pretty much always going to have to commit 2 spells to killing the Jinx. There are certain situations where you can get away with not doing it, but they are few and far between. overall, when you're looking at your hand, plan to commit at least 2 resources to that. So if you are trying to sit here and, play card for card, remove every unit that your opponent plays, stop when you get down to 2 spells and think, do I need to absolutely save these 2 for the Jinx? Even if it's something like Double Death's Hand or Noxian Fervor Make It Rain or literally anything in Ravenous Flock, it can be too difficult to push damage onto the Jinx during combat. Your opponent doesn't necessarily have to play for that. Your aggressive plan doesn't work super well unless you can combine it with a board wipe like a Twisted Fate or a Make It Rain, because as much as you want to go wide on board as the Twisted Fate Swain deck, and you can have the opportunity to do that with things like Dreadweight Deckhand, Petty Officer, House Spider, your opponent can match you with things like Jury Rig, Zonite Urchin, Poro Cannon, getting those daring Poros. And we didn't see it come up super big in this particular matchup, but it is a possibility. And this is where the mind games come into it a little bit. I mean, assume that your opponent is going to be able to get the Super Mega Death Rocket Dive every turn. Assume that they are going to be able to empty their hand in response to the Jinx. And this is where things get scary for both players. Type V has to think, am I maintaining enough resources to kill a second copy of Jinx? And Zero is thinking, am I going to find a second Jinx? There are a lot of bad top decks in the Discard Aggro deck, and this is where things kind of come down to luck. Both players find themselves in a position that they're kind of okay with. If Zero draws another Jinx, that's probably game over. Look at how much damage is being represented here. The Rocket is 20% of your life total. And it's not necessarily okay to only think of your life total in terms of rockets, because if Zero's hand was Mystic Shot Jinx, you were just dead. And that's why the burn is so scary. That's why even at 10 HP, you don't necessarily feel safe, and you have to worry about getting rid of that Jinx as quickly as possible. As inefficiently as you have to get it done, you do have to get it done. And I recommend saving things like Twisted Fate for Jinx specifically if your opponent isn't wide on board to the point where going for a red card feels good. Gold card on the Ravenous Flock, or just red card in a Ravenous Flock, gold card in a Death's Hand, whatever you got to do to get it done, get that Jinx off the table as fast as possible. And now Type V has the advantage, could go for something close to lethal either this turn or next turn, thanks to getting that leveled Swain out. And this is what I was talking about, Swain playing out big in this matchup, not only for the healthy body that he represents as a good blocker, but in terms of sort of pushing through enough damage to end the game quickly enough that your opponent has less turns to try and find that Jinx. Because Zero's got a lot of bad top decks. Poro Cannon, Jury Rig, Rummage. Rummage ain't great. Brothers Bond, Flame Chompers, Vision. There's a lot of bad top decks. Even an Augmented Experimenter at this point doesn't necessarily get him out of the woods because he's not able to play anything else in the same turn. We see the Make It Rain out of Type V here to actually go ahead and go for lethal. Zero is probably just going to play the Rummage into the Jury Rig in combat to get the block down onto the Petty Officer, and he has to. Otherwise, he would have liked to save that Rummage for next turn, and I think it was good on the side of Type V to actually play that proactively and force your opponent to, if their hand is something like Jury Rig Rummage, you don't want them to be able to get one card deeper before they play that Rummage, get another card closer to that Jinx. Get Excited, another very bad top deck. You really need to find the refuel here, and I do believe that if Zero found a Jinx, there's a very good chance that he would be the winner of the game. Not when your last card in hand is Get Excited, but in general, I think that he had a pretty good shot at cobbling together a win. For example, if that Get Excited were a Jinx, Zero would actually just win the game here. Well, not really, because Type V does have a Noxian Fervor, but in theory, he would have the opportunity to win. And while I'm not totally sold that this is the way the matchup is always going to go, I did just kind of want to talk on some of the key points in the matchup, what you have to do, and what the players can do to get it done. And this time around, Type V does get it done, picking up the win against the Discard Aggro. Got him in casting mode. I'm supposed to be in analysis mode. But yeah, if you are looking to take something into aggro decks, Twisted Fate Swain is not a bad choice, but it's not the best choice that you have out there. There's no healing available. The removal onto Jinx is pretty expensive in terms of the actual card advantage that it costs you. And overall, I'm not sure that it's necessarily favored one way or the other. I don't think it's really 50-50, but it's definitely a matchup I'm going to have to keep my eyes on and kind of expand my brain into. Because we did see, as I had mentioned, just as much discard aggro this weekend as we did Aurelion Soul. I wanted to cover some A-Soul matchups, but honestly, we're just not really seeing the deck. So anyway, that is going to do it for me, guys. I hope this helped. Thank you so much for sticking around and watching this one. My name is Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your tournaments.